I'm Eric Lindstrom, Executive Director of Farm Animal Rights Movement. This final episode in our series explores our progress and future prospects in reducing animal exploitation. It also covers the changes in our movement and in our movement's impact on society. I will begin with a general summary of how advancing technology is reducing our dependence on exploitation of animals, as well as some key gains for animals over the past 50 years. PETA's Vice President Laboratory Investigation Cases, Al Kachana, will discuss the progress and prospects for animals used in entertainment, fashion, and vivisection. Founder of Stop Animal Exploitation Now, Michael Budke, will follow with his perception of the changes in vivisection. Mary Finelli, founder of Fishfeel, will cover aquatic animals used for food. Paul Shapiro, founder of Compassion Over Killing and the Better Meat Company, and I will follow with our interpretation of how our movement has changed in the past 5 decades. Then philosopher Peter Singer and Paul Shapiro will share their views on how the movement has affected American society. Since the dawn of civilization, humans have depended on non-human animals for food, fashion, sacrifices, lighting, communication, transport, labor, amusement, warfare, and eventually medical research. With technological advances reducing our dependence on animals, more charitable attitudes towards animals have prevailed, including the notions of animal welfare and animal rights. Invention of the telegraph in 1844 liberated millions of homing pigeons from being torn hundreds of miles from their homes. Invention of kerosene ended the slaughter of sperm whales for lamp oil. Development of the steam and diesel engines in the 19th century liberated horses and mules from long-distance transport and agricultural labor. Development of the gasoline engine and the automobile at the turn of the 20th century liberated more horses from urban transport. More recently, development of synthetic fibers has greatly reduced the demand for animal skin, wool, feathers, and silk. Unfortunately, advancing technology has not been kind to the exploitation of animals for food. The broad availability of antibiotics following World War II has allowed extreme crowding and caging of animals raised for food, reducing prices and increasing consumption. Fishing vessels have grown bigger, more powerful, and much more destructive to sea life. Still, our movement has been able to record some remarkable gains over the past 5 decades. 5 decades ago, there were 6 vegetarian societies in major cities and no animal rights groups. Today we're everywhere. 5 decades ago, animal rights was a quaint concept, fancied by a small handful of academians. Today, scores of books and hundreds of essays and videos cover every aspect. Most law schools include a course in animal law. 5 decades ago, few had ever heard the word vegan or considered animal-free eating. Today, all supermarkets offer animal-free entrees, desserts, and milks. Most national franchises and gourmet restaurants offer an animal-free option. Major publications and hundreds of videos are touting animal-free eating, and dozens of websites offer multiple recipes. 5 decades ago, nutritionists claimed that one could only obtain a complete protein from animal sources, or by carefully combining complementary vegetable proteins. Today, even the conservative Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics endorses a plant-based diet. 5 decades ago, there were no alternatives to cow's or goat's milk and yogurt. Today, grain and nut milks have the dairy industry up against the ropes. 5 decades ago, the use of animals in research, training, and testing was loosely governed by the permissive Animal Welfare Act of 1966. Today's amended version strictly regulates the trade and care of these animals. 5 decades ago, the infamous Draize test allowed testing the toxicity of cosmetics on the eyes of rabbits. Today, that test has been largely phased out. 5 decades ago, nearly all U.S. medical schools were using live dogs and other animals in surgical training. Today, few do. 5 decades ago, animal skin, fur, wool, silk, and feathers were used extensively by the fashion industry. Today, all these products have been replaced by excellent and less costly man-made materials. 5 decades ago, animal racing and fighting and animal circus acts were a popular form of entertainment. Today, dog and cockfighting are illegal in nearly every state. A number of cities have banned animal circus acts.
So these 2 cases, the Silver Spring Monkeys case and the UPenn Baboon Head Injury Clinic, these were brought before members of Congress, and again, the American public was shocked. Members of Congress say they received more letters from the public about these cases than even the Vietnam War. And this really shook up the public, it shook up the legislature, and legislators from both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, took action. And, up to that point, there was a single federal law in the United States that governed the treatment of animals in laboratories, but it was restricted to how animals, in particular dogs and cats, got to the laboratory and what happened to the animals' bodies, how those bodies were disposed of after they had been used, abused, and killed. You know, how were those corpses going to be disposed of? That was the Animal Welfare Act. And when these two cases came in front of the US Congress, the 1985 amendments to the Animal Welfare Act were passed. This basically was like a seismic change, shaking up the entire animal experimentation industry, where all of a sudden what happened in laboratories was in fact something that the agency overseeing laboratories, the US Department of Agriculture, would have a say in. And so for the first time, all laboratories that used animals who were covered under the Animal Welfare Act had to have veterinarians. They had to have an institutionally based oversight body that was ensuring that certain strictures were applied, and so on. So it was a massive shift. So there was this legislative shift, and then there was also public awareness that shifted radically because of those two cases. What we've seen since 1980, when PETA came onto the map and those early investigations, the ALF raids, there's been increasing scientific involvement in what happens to animals in laboratories. Scientists have been asking the question, is what's happening to animals in laboratories, are these experiments that are being done, are they actually informing what happens at the human patient bedside? And a lot of people who are not animal rights activists or not even animal welfare proponents have been doing things like systematic reviews where they review the literature, you know, all of the experiments that have been done, let's say, in the area of depression or in the area of Alzheimer's research or cancer research, or any number of diseases and conditions. And they will say all of these animal experiments that have been done and the data that has come out of these animal experiments, has it actually yielded cures or treatments for human beings? What these scientific analyses have found is that the answer is no. That this is one world over here, which is animal experimentation, and this is another world over here, which is how doctors treat their patients. And the problem is that historically, up until very, very recently, most funding has gone to animal experiments. Most biomedical research funding to solve human health issues has gone to animal experimentation. But when we know that 95% of all new drugs that test safe and effective in animals are found to be either unsafe or ineffective in human beings, when we know that less than 10% of highly promising discoveries in animal experiments actually translate to something for humans, we realize that our investments in animal experimentation is really like flushing money down the toilet. And so this new critique of animal experimentation that has been going on for the last 20 years or so has really shook up the industry, you know, to the point where just earlier this year, on April 29th, 2025, the National Institutes of Health, which is the world's largest funder of biomedical experiments using animals, the largest funder, funding animal experiments to the tune of more than $20 billion every year, the NIH said, we're going to stop. We are going to shift our priorities and go to human relevant methods like organs on chips, like organoids, like artificial intelligence, bioinformatics, take big data and supercomputing, marry these things and get human relevant results so we can get cures and treatments for human beings. The NIH acknowledged what we have been saying for all these years, that animal experiments don't yield treatments or cures for human beings. We've got to do better. The future looks very bright right now. I mean, make no mistake, we have a lot of work to do. There are right now more than 100 million animals in US laboratories, and they are living lives of extreme privation, of deprivation, of pain, agony, depression, misery, and they don't deserve to be there. This needs to end. But The writing is on the wall. The paradigm is shifting. There are seismic changes being made in the industry in the United States and around the world. But now that the animal experimenters are being forced to say, prove it, prove that what you're doing is actually going to help human beings, I think we're going to see a radical shift. It couldn't have come soon enough. So I think the future is really, really promising, and we're going to work our hardest to make sure it comes as fast as possible.
One of the things I remember very clearly is public opinion on this issue. When we first became involved in the animal research area in 1986, the public was, for the most part, very uninformed about animal research. If they knew it happened, which most people didn't, they were essentially supportive of it because they had been brainwashed by the animal research industry. They had been given the choice of your dog or your child, and of course they chose their child. However, over the decades, we have done a tremendous amount of education on the animal research issue. Whatever animal rights organization you want to talk about that deals with the animal research issue, one of the goals has always been to get the research into the news media to educate people, because the only way to change opinion is with facts. In the 1980s, over 70% of the general public was in favor of the use of animals in research. If we fast forward to today, after years of news media coverage and hundreds of wins and a plethora of changes, over 50% of the American public is now opposed to the use of animals in research. That is a huge change. Initially, most people didn't know what consumer product testing is. Now there are hundreds of companies that produce their products without using animals in testing. And in fact, there are even 12 states in the United States that have banned the use of animals in cosmetics testing. More recently, we've seen changes where, through the work of the Center for a Humane Economy, the FDA Modernization Act has led to the phasing out of the requirement for testing of drugs on animals. The legislation is still being implemented, but it is moving forward.
It's been another area where we're seeing phenomenal shifts away from the use of animals for clothing and toward non-animal materials. I mean, everybody thinks about fur when they think of the use of animals in fashion, and we all know that fur is dead. All of the big fashion houses no longer use fur. You know, there are one or two holdouts at this point, but you know, all of the big names that you can think of are no longer using fur. And you know, we know that very big designers like Stella McCartney famously don't use any animal products in their designs, and they're very well regarded. I remember, and I think, you know, most animal rights activists remember, you know, being outside of Macy's, being outside of Nordstrom's, being outside of Saks Fifth Avenue, all of these different stores, these big department stores that used to have fur salons. You know, I remember 20 years ago, one by one, they stopped, you know, they closed their fur salons, and it was really fantastic. None of these stores sell fur anymore. We know that there are countries that don't permit the sale of furs, like Israel. The state of California doesn't permit the sale of new fur. There are cities that don't permit the sale of fur. Young people wouldn't be caught dead in fur. You know, there are these little resurgences that you hear about where people talk about, oh, well, if it's, you know, fur that you buy from a thrift store, then maybe it's okay. You know, to me, those are the cries of an industry in its dying throes. But we're really talking about an industry that's basically dead. There's been a lot of progress made in other areas too. You know, at PETA, we knew that fur wasn't enough. We had to go after leather. We had to go after exotic skins. We're talking about ostrich and alligator skin, snake skin, all of these things, the exotic skins. We had to go after wool. have to go after mohair and Angora. PETA has done dozens and dozens of investigations, undercover investigations, where our people work inside these facilities. They take jobs, work inside the facilities, and wear hidden cameras so they can capture exactly what's going on. And seeing animals in, the leather industry, for example, cows being skinned while they're still conscious. Seeing cows being strung up by one leg and having their throat slit and they're being bled out, even as they're being dismembered. Just these really barbaric methods of killing animals, of taking their skins from them, letting people know that leather is not a byproduct of the meat industry, that is a co-product of the meat industry. And in fact, it's the lucrative leather industry that props up the beef industry and allows it to continue in spite of the fact that a lot of people are getting away from red meat, beef, and so on. So leather, really needs to go down, and we're seeing that a lot of companies are no longer selling leather. We had big campaigns against stores like Gap. There are designers who will not use leather. There are car companies, when they offer their interiors, and it's the same with wool. We've done dozens and dozens of undercover investigations at wool facilities. People tend to think that wool is like a haircut. No, that is not true. You go to these places, Australia is one of the biggest countries that produces wool, and they have practices like mulesing, where they actually cut off flesh from the backsides of sheep to prevent fly strike, but this is done without pain relief. It is absolutely horrific to watch. The lambs are bleeding and crying out in pain. And keep in mind that all of these industries where animals are used and abused, once they are no longer producing commercially viable levels of wool or whatever, Angora, mohair, whatever it might be, those animals are sent to slaughter. The same slaughterhouses where animals who are used for food, exploited for food, are sent. The prospects are huge for additional reduction of use of animals in the fashion industry, because the alternatives to the materials that are derived from animals are so great. They can be engineered to have better properties, whether it's breathability. I remember 20 years ago, sneakers were being made less and less with leather and more with these synthetics. And one of the big reasons was that you can wash synthetics, you can't wash leather. So from the perspective of keeping a pair of sneakers, which aren't cheap, for longer, it was better to get the synthetics. Now it's so easy to get these synthetic products, whether you're talking about sneakers or any other type of shoe or other product, coats, sweaters, et cetera, et cetera. So the more we see the market being saturated with cruelty-free products in the fashion industry, the easier it is for the consumer, and the more we're going to see the decline. There have been massive shifts in how the public views the use of animals in entertainment. The biggest victory, I would say, bar none, in the past couple of decades has been Ringling Brothers Circus. I think most people remember when Ringling Brothers would come to town and they would have the march of the elephants from where the trains would stop over to the venue, the big top where they would be performing. And this was happening in towns, across the US, across Canada and elsewhere. And they would also have the lions and the tigers in tow and other animals who were being used. It was in 2017 when Ringling made the announcement that they would retire elephants and then all animals from their circuses. And now they've gone to completely human performers in their circuses. And so these are people who want to be there, people who enjoy being under a big top, who don't need bull hooks, to be beaten by bull hooks in order to perform. We also know that the movie Blackfish, the documentary Blackfish, made a huge change in how people see places like SeaWorld. these what we call marine abusement parks. And we see that all of these abusement parks are moving away from using these intelligent, beautiful animals like orcas in their shows. We know that the breeding of orcas stopped in the United States, and other countries are following suit. And that basically means that there's a light at the end of this tunnel. We are seeing a timeline here where we will see that there are no more orcas, no more dolphins, and no more other animals being used in these places of abuse and confinement, imprisonment, deprivation, privation, and early death. Similarly, in movies, on television shows, with the advent of CGI, computer-generated imagery, puppetry, and other beautifully creative animatronics and other things, we see that with all of these technologies, animals are used less and less in entertainment, in movies and television shows. And we think this is absolutely wonderful. I always look for the AHA, the American Humane Association, approved this film. The AHA is just at the place where the film is being shot, where the movie is being shot when the filming is going on. But they're not watching what happens to the animals when the filming is not happening. What conditions are those animals living in? You know, what happens to the animals when they're retired from the industry? You know, are they thrown into a roadside zoo? More than likely, yes. We see that as the public becomes more aware of who animals are, the fact that elephants are such intelligent animals, orcas, such intelligent animals, chimpanzees, that their lives matter to them, that they deserve to have a life of freedom and not a life of imprisonment just for our amusement. As the public becomes more aware of the sentience of animals, and as technologies improve for having movies that tell stories about animals without having to exploit those animals, you know, so whether you're talking about CGI or animatronics or puppetry or any number of things, those technologies keep improving. They're astonishing. And as that happens, we can tell better stories than we could ever tell by using live animals. So the public will not only demand that we don't want to see live animals being exploited for our amusement, but they will be saying, I want to see that better technology being used because that storytelling is way better. You know, I feel like I'm really in that story. You know, when you think about things like Swim with Dolphins or these other sorts of things, there are a lot of animatronic, robotic. On one hand, this speaks to how much we love animals because we want to be near them. We want to see them. We want to interact with them. On the other hand, when we see what happens so that these animals can be placed in those circumstances, we see that it's not always great for the animals. In fact, it's never great for the animals.
The global consumption of fish consumption, has doubled over the past half century. And in the meantime, the number of fish stocks that are fished faster than they can reproduce has also more than doubled. So the situation is quite grim for fishes. In fact, 90 to 95% of the fish stocks are fished at a rate now at the maximum that they can sustain or beyond. So things are quite grim, and fish consumption is expected to increase. People are looking to fish farming as a solution, but it's actually a huge part of the problem because half of the wild-caught fishes are turned into fish meal and fish oil, and 3/4 of that is used to feed farmed fishes and other farmed animals. So fish farming is really a huge part of the overfishing problem. Because ships are having to go further and further out to catch these fishes, they are also more expensive. So the way they're trying to counter that is human slavery. They're actually enslaving people on these fishing boats and other human rights abuses in the seafood industry. So we are really desertifying the ocean. They're catching 1 to 2 trillion, it's estimated that 1 to 2 trillion fishes are caught every year, and 100 million tons of fish are being produced with fish through fish farming. So this is a huge problem. It's really an astronomical problem. Thankfully, the public is becoming more and more aware of these issues. Scientists now have the technology to study fishes in their natural environment, and the scientific community is paying more attention to fish sentience. In 2010, Victoria Brainsworth wrote the book, Do Fish Feel Pain? And explains very elegantly that the answer is yes, they do feel pain. And in 2017, ethologist Jonathan Balcom published the book, What a Fish Knows, all about how interesting and amazing and admirable these fishes are. He thought if the public realized what scientists were finding out, it would really change their perception of fishes. And it has. And it became a New York Times bestseller and got a lot of media attention. Just this month, there's an abridged version of the book, What a Fish Knows, available now, called Fish Sense. Also, in 2020, the documentary Seaspiracy came out, and it was wildly popular, one of Netflix's most popular offerings, and garnered a lot of media attention too. So, things are improving for fishes in that way. As far as human rights abuses, that's becoming more widely known. The Associated Press won a Pulitzer Prize for its expose on human slavery in the fishing industry, and the New York Times did an extensive series on it, and that's also getting more and more attention. Vegan seafood options are also becoming more available, and the market for it is burgeoning. There are so many vegan seafood options available now, and millions are being spent in investment in vegan seafood options and also sell cultivated seafood. And just this past May, the company Wildtype received the first FDA approval for a cell-cultivated seafood product, which is their cell-cultivated salmon, making them the first company to bring cell-cultivated seafood to the U.S. market.
I remember when I became vegan in 1993, PETA was passing out booklets lamenting the fact that there were 6 billion animals going into U.S. slaughter plants annually. Well, today, over 30 years later, that number is closer to 10 billion animals, right? And it's not just because there are more humans. Yes, population growth is part of it, but a bigger part of it is that per capita consumption of meat has gone up, not down. So we shouldn't sugarcoat it. Yes, there are many areas where progress has been made, but for the most part, meat demand has gone up. Per capita vegetarianism has roughly been about the same. Yet, as sobering as those two facts are, I do think that there are many places where we can look that are very hopeful. First, the alternatives to animal products have seen an explosion of popularity and an explosion of innovation. And so if you look at the very first products that ever were used as recipes to replace meat, it literally goes back more than 1,000 years to ancient China, where they were for Buddhist monks trying to create products that would displace meat, that would have a somewhat meat-like texture. And there was really not much innovation in that product line, right, in plant-based meats, for about a millennium. Right? About a millennium, there was really no innovation. Then in the 1970s and 80s, you had companies coming along like Tofurky and Light Life that started making products that were even more meat-like than the products that the ancient Chinese were making. And then you start getting into like the 2010s and you see other companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods that really took it to a far greater extent, where they were making alternatives to meat that really were not designed for vegetarians, but were designed for meat lovers. And those companies still have a long way to go, as does the entire alternative protein sector. But that is a very good sign, and I'll tell you why. It would be great if most people were happy to switch from eating meat to eating bean and rice burritos and lentil soup and hummus wraps. That would be great. I love those foods. Sadly, I just think that those will never replace meat. Most people really love meat. They crave meat. They want that experience of eating meat. And so if you ask people to switch to a bean and rice burrito rather than meat, yes, there'll be some subset of people who are willing to do it, but the vast majority of people aren't. We have to create something that people love, that they crave, that they want, that they're happy to eat instead of meat, and it cannot be viewed as sacrificial. Just in the same way that people switched to electric vehicles once they were viewed as cooler and better than the regular internal combustion engine vehicles, or just in the same way that people switched to metal fountain pens because they were a better experience than quills, right? There's all types of reasons why we need to make the alternative meats taste as good, if not better, be as cheap, if not cheaper, and be as convenient, meaning in the right places in the supermarket where people are already shopping. And there's been an explosion. I mean, I remember when I started eating plant-based meats in the 90s, they were either in the produce section, where nobody's buying meat in the produce section, right? They're in the produce section, or they were in the frozen section in some corner of the grocery store, right? Today, plant-based meat is in the meat section itself. People going to buy hamburgers can get Beyond Burgers right next to that product. And so that is a major improvement and a major way to improve the convenience factor for people, so you don't have to train them to switch to a different part of the supermarket. Similarly, the number of products that now exist is much greater, and so the options are much greater for people. But we're still struggling with what I call the 3 Ps. One is price. These products are just too expensive compared to conventional animal meat. 2 is performance. Many times they don't taste as good as animal meat. And then 3 is the perception. Some people have this perception that it's an overly processed product. But those 3 problems, price, performance, and perception, can be overcome. And I think one of the best ways to overcome them is through mycelial fermentation, to create products that are all natural, non-processed, whole food, delicious, and inexpensive. But there are other things that we can do too. And you look at many of the innovators in the alternative meat space, many of whom are animal activists who came out of the nonprofit animal movement world and went into the world of entrepreneurship in order to create new products to help animals. If you look, for example, at Ethan Brown or Pat Brown, the 2 co-founders of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, respectively, both of them started their companies because they wanted to help animals. That was their mission, right? It's not like they were just capitalists who wanted to make money. They were mission-oriented founders, not just mercenaries. And so the animal movement has done a great job of producing lots of inventors and investors who are now working to render the exploitation of animals obsolete via new technologies. Other advances that have been made for farmed animals include massive awareness raising. And so in some cases, this has led to the decimation of industries, like in the veal industry, where veal has now become a 4-letter word and most people don't want to even associate with it because of animal cruelty, right? It's not like, people who reduced their red meat consumption and switched to chicken, they didn't do it for animal welfare reasons. They did it because they thought of chicken as being healthier and cheaper than beef. But in the case of veal, people really did stop because of animal welfare reasons. There were awareness-raising campaigns, full-page ads in newspapers, and more that really associated veal with animal cruelty, and that was sufficient to get many people to stop consuming veal. Similarly, foie gras is another instance where numerous cities and countries have banned the production and sometimes even the sale of foie gras. In California, it's illegal to sell foie gras now because of the animal cruelty that is caused in the force feeding of these ducks and geese. And these are the type of laws that really can make a very big difference, not only in reducing the number of animals who are exploited for food, but in setting the precedent that there are some things that we can do to other animals that are so heinous, that are so cruel and inhumane, that they simply should not be permitted by law. And in those cases, I see them as great precedents to be set, so that no, we don't stop there, obviously, but there are important precedents that are set that when I became vegan and got involved in the animal protection movement would have been only a fantasy for people to start passing laws banning the sale of certain animal products because of animal cruelty reasons. That would have been unheard of.
Over the past 5 decades, our movement has undergone dramatic changes in tactics, composition, focus, and funding. Most major social reforms take place in several stages, sometimes referred to as the attention stage, the discussion stage, and the enactment stage. Over the past 5 decades, our movement tactics have pretty much followed this pattern. We started with disruptions, sit-ins, occupations, raids, and street theater to get public attention to the issue of animal abuse. Next, we promoted discussion of the issue with distribution of literature, lectures, and social media posts. Today, we attempt to enact remedial legislation and develop alternative tests and products. For the first 3 decades, ours was largely a grassroots movement. Composed of dedicated volunteers. 2 decades ago, as major donors realized that the movement was not going away and catching public attention and deserving their investment, many grassroots volunteers became paid employees with all the usual advantages and drawbacks. For some, animal rights became more of a career than a mission. The most drastic change has been in our movement's focus. For the first 2 decades, our movement was pretty much focused on combating vivisection and a bit more on the use of fur in fashion. The use of animals for food, which represents 99% of animal abuse, was considered too tough to tackle. This issue was first introduced by Jim Mason and Peter Singer in their 1980 photographic book, Animal Factories. It was picked up immediately by our own farm animal rights movement, leading to our national Veal-Ben campaign, World Day for Farmed Animals, Great American Meat Out, and much more. We were joined in 1985 by Henry Spira's Coalition to Abolish Factory Farming, and in 1990 by Karen Davis's United Poultry Concerns. Paul Shapiro formed Compassion Over Killing, now Animal Outlook, in 1995. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals took a serious position on farmed animals in 1996. Our movement's concern for the monumental destruction of aquatic life, other than whales, has been much more recent. Today, our movement is almost entirely focused on the exploitation of animals for food. Initially, activism around the use of animals for food was pretty evenly divided between the utilitarians or animal welfare advocates who sought to improve conditions of animals on factory farms, and the abolitionists or animal rights advocates seeking to end the use of animals for food altogether. That balance evaporated during the past decade with the influx of hundreds of millions of dollars from the utilitarian Open Philanthropy Foundation. Today, only a couple organizations still retain the abolitionist stance on farmed animals.
In the last 30 or so years that I've been involved in the animal movement, I've seen a movement that has constantly gotten smarter. I remember in the 1990s, we were all running around getting arrested. And I'm not saying that there's never a time and place for peaceful civil disobedience. Obviously, that's not my point. We've become far more sophisticated in the tools that we are using, whether that's shareholder advocacy, legislation, state ballot initiatives, technology, investing in and advancing animal-free technologies. The movement has become more professional and more strategic in the way that it operates than it was in an earlier era. And I have seen and participated in many of these types of practices, right? From the civil disobedience to the undercover investigations to a whole variety of other means. And I am not suggesting that there's never a time and place for those. I am suggesting, though, that animals need us to win. It is not enough to be right. We have to be effective. Being right is never enough. If being right was enough, this would have ended decades ago. Being right is never enough. You have to be both right and effective. And I remember giving a speech about 25 years ago at New York University. And the speech was entitled, "If we are hoarse from yelling, why is no one listening?" And I was lamenting the fact that we were really good at chanting and people were good at getting arrested and they were good at taking over offices and so on. But we weren't as good at actually winning campaigns. Think about animal experimentation as just one example. Since the 19th century, animal groups were lamenting vivisection and trying to stop it. And yet it wasn't until Henry Spira's campaigns in the 1980s and 90s that we actually started succeeding in ending certain animal experiments. And now we see the work of organizations like White Coat Waste Project actually succeeding in emptying labs and by painting it as government waste. This is an example of the animal movement getting more strategic and looking at ways to win. Their argument is not merely that it's inhumane. It's not merely that these tests don't work. It is that it is wasteful spending. And right now we have an administration that was looking to cut wasteful spending. So this is an example of how the animal movement has become more effective in getting the ends that we want for animals by engaging in arguments that maybe aren't the arguments that are most motivating for animal activists, but are nevertheless arguing in favor of what people want to hear, who are the ones making the decisions. That's just one example. And I think over and over again, as we're seeing the animal movement becoming more sophisticated, more strategic, more professional in ways that will ultimately benefit animals in the long run.
Well, when Animal Liberation was published, There were some people who took it seriously, fortunately, but there were also people who just tried to ridicule it, tried to laugh it off and said, well, animal rights? Animals don't have rights. We know that rights are for humans. So it took some time to get across the idea that there really is a case for saying that animals have rights, or that animals should have rights that they are not legally recognized as having now, that we should not be treating them in the way that they are, has now become, I think, a widely shared view, to the extent that whenever the American public get a chance to vote on these issues, they actually vote for much better condition for animals. So, for example, in California, which is one of those states where if you get enough signatures on a petition, you can get a referendum to be held on a new law. When there have been referendums, there have been 2 of them, to improve the conditions of farmed animals, give them more space, enable them to at least freely stretch their limbs, which they couldn't even do previously and still can't do in most states of the United States. When you get them to vote on it, they overwhelmingly support those initiatives. California, it was, I think, 63% in favor. When Massachusetts held a referendum, it was 78%. I think the American public regards the animal movement quite positively. The problem is that American politics is essentially corrupt, because lobbying has such a huge influence in the American political system. Money has a huge influence, much more, I would say, than in any of the other democratic countries I'm familiar with, much more than in Australia, where I'm talking to you from now, much more than in England, where I lived for several years, much more than in other European countries that I know about, where they have been able to get important changes for animals through Parliament. You know, if you look at what has the United States Congress done for animals, it's passed slaughter laws, but it has never passed a law to regulate how animals can be kept on factory farms, to regulate how crowded they can be, how much space they should have. It's not got any federal regulations that protect all animals from painful experimentation. In fact, there aren't even statistics on the vast majority of the animals used in research. Statistics are only kept on a small number of animals, dogs, cats, primates, and not on the majority of animals used. Legislation in the United States is really lagging far behind public opinion on this issue.
When I became vegan, people did not know what the word meant, let alone how to pronounce it. Now everybody at least knows that. When I became vegan, the thought of somebody doing that was completely foreign. You would think of this person as somebody who would obviously be a social outcast, somebody who you didn't want to hang around or come to your parties and so on. Now, though, many of the most famous athletes are vegan. Many of the most successful athletes are vegan. Many celebrities and other influencers are vegan, and they show that this can be a cool, popular thing to do, as it is. And so the perception of what vegans are has dramatically changed. So much so that I remember in one movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, Arnold accuses Sylvester of, quote, hitting like a vegetarian to try to put him down. Now, Arnold Schwarzenegger argues that you should eat less meat, and he makes videos promoting eating less meat, and he talks about why people need to eat less meat and that it's nonsense for people to think you need meat in order to build muscle. And just that one example alone, that Arnold Schwarzenegger, who represented masculinity when I was a kid, right? This was the guy who was like the person who little boys wanted to grow up to be. And the fact that he now is one of the most outspoken champions for meat reduction is an example of how far our society has come on this particular point. And it's not just him. I mean, you look at somebody like Carl Lewis, who was the fastest man on the planet at one point, and he talks about how being vegan was among the reasons that he was such a successful Olympian runner, and both sprinter and long jumper. And the list goes on and on and on. And so now, because of documentaries on Netflix that have helped to shape the view of what veganism and vegans are like, I do think that there is a change. Many years ago, there was a poll that showed that vegans were among the least respected group in society. And I haven't seen an updated poll, but I would bet that it might be different now, considering how the perception has changed in some regards with regard to this. At the same time, We are the most inventive and innovative species that this planet has ever seen, and we are capable of inventing new ways of doing things that render the old ways obsolete. And so I am optimistic that we will find ways to limit some of the damage that we have done. For those animals who experience torture and will never live to see that day, my heart breaks. For those species who went extinct already and won't survive to see that future, my heart breaks. But I do not consign myself to the pessimism of thinking that we cannot change, because we have changed in the past and we will continue changing in the future. It's not self-executing. It doesn't happen on its own. Not one of these people who believes that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. Sometimes it is bent toward justice, but it doesn't just naturally bend toward justice. But through action and strategic persuasion that we can engage in, I truly believe that we can invent our way out of so many of the problems that we face, whether it's animal exploitation, climate change, and so on.
Thank you for watching episode 6, the final in our 5 Decades, 1 Mission video series, which explored our movement's progress in ending animal exploitation, noted changes in our movement's character, and assessed our impact on American society. We welcome your comments on the 5 Decades, 1 Mission video series. Please email us at info@farmusa.org.